Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. It's January 5th, 2021, the first recorded episode of History Comes Alive in the new year. And I hope you all had a great holiday season. I'm really looking forward to 2021, and I hope that you are too. I hope you're looking forward to it as a new year. I mean, we've had a challenging year in 2020. Between COVID and jobs and employment and personal finances and stresses and relationships, and then there's the politics of it. So I'm hoping that 2021 gets a little bit better for us all. I'm also excited about 2021 for the direction that we're going to take in the podcast. We've been together now for 3 or 4 months, and we've built the case. We've been building toward the development of English colonialism in the New World. And this is really the first episode where we're going to begin to string along some sense of a chronological narrative timeline of those events. So for the last few weeks, we've talked about the overall atmosphere in both England and New England just prior to the advent of English colonialism. The parallels between the two were striking. Both cultures were experiencing unprecedented changes, uncomfortable changes, loaded with uncertainty. It was in this emotionally charged environment the Pilgrims settled at Plymouth. The foundation has been laid, and today we begin to develop the dual narrative of colonial unity in the 13 British colonies and the intentional activity of the various native tribes already inhabiting the land. The title of the episode could be First Encounter, referring to a specific event that we'll take a second look at in just a few minutes. It's an event that was named by Miles Standish. Or we could have named it First Encounters, plural, in an effort to capture the essence of several primary encounters that occurred between December of 1620 and March of 1621, between that small group of English dissidents remembered as the Pilgrims, and the natives that they encountered upon their arrival in their new homeland. But I've actually chosen to title this Massasoit, Part 1, after the Wampanoag sachem, Massasoit, who may very well be the most pivotal, essential character in all of the Pilgrim story. All of the colonial New England story, for that matter. That's a bold statement, and it may very well be true. As we examine the narrative for the next few weeks, keep that statement in mind. It may not seem so far-fetched by the time we're done. I think that Massasoit is one of those characters who's been largely lost to history and shouldn't have been, if for no other reason than he played an influential role in helping the Pilgrims to get established. His legacy continued to sponsor the Pilgrims and their posterity for decades after he passed from the scene. We'll open our time together by revisiting an event that we did previously cover. This time we'll have a little more context. This time we'll develop the scene with the goal of moving past it and continuing the storyline. So if you remember, the area which the Pilgrims landed was, first of all, uncharted, right? So, they settled outside of their designated chartered area of what would have been recognized as Northern Virginia. And secondly, it had been recently cleared of its previous inhabitants due to disease. And third, it was surrounded by many native groups. Now, for our immediate purposes, we're going to talk about the Nausets, the Narragansetts, and most importantly, the Wampanoags. And I would just say as a side note, I like to get the context and the storyline down. I'm not always good at pronunciations. I do attempt to look them up, but as we get further into the series and we're talking more and more about some of the native tribes and people and names, I may get some of those wrong. And if you're out there and if you're of native heritage and you know the name the way it should be pronounced, I apologize in advance. But the 3 tribes that we're going to be looking at in the short future are the Nausets, the Narragansetts, and the Wampanoags. And if you recall, we've talked about the Nausets before. They had been one of those tribes that had suffered loss after Thomas Hunt tricked their folks, under false pretenses, to enter into trade with him. and he subsequently kidnapped or stole 24 natives and took them to Europe. And they were understandably hostile towards the English. They were located primarily on that peninsula of Cape Cod across the water from Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket Island, east of the Wampanoags. And the Narragansetts had been one of the regional powerhouses. They shared that regional power, that dominance with the Pequots to the east. And we'll talk about them quite extensively over the next few months. Though still powerful, the Narragansetts had recently lost a sizable portion of their population due to plague and disease. They were primarily located in the aptly named Narragansett Bay area, that area kind of between Massachusetts and Rhode Island, right on that border, and then into the state of Rhode Island, today's Rhode Island. And they were tucked between the formidable Pequot Mohegan people to the west and the Wampanoags to the east. And they were adversaries of both. Now, the Wampanoags were powerful enough to hold their own. They were located primarily on the Cape Cod area in the state of Massachusetts. Their neighbors, in addition to the Narragansetts and the Nausetts, were the Massachusetts. And these will all play a role in our story. It was the Wampanoags that were closest in proximity to the Pilgrims. The area they settled had been the village of the Pawtuxet tribe, and they're a band within the larger Wampanoag group. And they had all died except one. Now, the most influential Wampanoag leader was Massasoit, or Massasoit. He proved to be a level-headed and shrewd leader, maybe the one guy able and willing to work with the Pilgrims. I mean, he not only didn't kill them, he put the word out that no Wampanoags were allowed to do them harm. I mean, that's huge. And as we'll discover, there were some, even in the Wampanoag camp, that did plan to exterminate the Pilgrims. Along the way, the next several months, many people will be mentioned from many groups, and many more could be, but they won't. Many of these folks have been lost to the narrative for one reason or another. And it's going to be good to work them back into the storyline itself. I'm going to try to offer a pretty comprehensive view of what was going on, but in no way is this exhaustive. So I would encourage, if this is exciting to you at all, I would encourage you to do study on your own. So this portion of the storyline is focused on how the Pilgrims got settled in their new land. I mean, we'll never know what colonialism would have looked like if they had failed, but we can imagine that it would have been a lot harder road to travel at the very least. So in the next 2 or maybe 3 episodes, we'll open the continuous narrative through the lens and the actions of 3 specific men. The first one is Miles Standish, and the second one is Squanto, and the third one, as I've mentioned, is Massasoit, who, again, in my mind, may be the single most critical personality in the New England story. He ensured the foothold and the success not only of the Pilgrims, but all of the Puritan colonies. So our story begins late 1620, November, December timeframe. The Pilgrims had just completed their voyage across the Atlantic on the Mayflower. They didn't just land at Plymouth Rock, but rather they explored the surrounding area of Cape Cod for weeks. They were malnourished and sickly, and they were curious about the landscape, and they were trying to find a suitable place to settle. Exploration of the New World, their New World, began possibly on November 11th, 1620. And it was 4 days until the small reconnaissance group that had been set out encountered any natives at all. And that was just a small group far away. And these were Nausetts. So after pursuing them for about 10 miles, the Pilgrims were unable to catch up with them. The journey had been rough. It was late in the year. Winter was coming. Food supplies were short. So it was that when the Pilgrims came across a buried store of corn, they helped themselves to all that they could manage to carry. And later they reported, after the fact, that this corn probably helped to save them from starvation. But nevertheless, it belonged to other people. That was Nauset corn. Remember, again, these are the guys that are most hostile to the English folks. These are the guys that were victims of Thomas Hunt. The Pilgrims also found grave sites. They found a European grave site, but they also found native grave sites, which they were smart enough to leave alone. And they also found empty wigwams, homes. And from these wigwams, they took some common native items. They didn't leave, nor did they bring back anything in trade. They just basically stole stuff from people that weren't home. Not a good way to enter the land. So it was probably December 8th that the first direct interaction occurred between the Nausets and the Pilgrims. No doubt the Nausets had been very well aware of their travels over those previous weeks. I mean, it depends on which account you read. I don't know if there was just one long Pilgrim party or if there were several smaller parties that had been sent out over the weeks. But the natives must have been aware of their presence and their movements. And so it was on the night of December 7th, a group of about 20 pilgrims set up camp for the night on the shoreline, complete with barricades. And about midnight, there was a, quote, great and hideous cry, or cries, end quote, in the darkness. And they were thought to maybe be wolves. I mean, that seems spooky. It's pitch dark, it's cold, it's damp, it's winter, you're on the shoreline in a strange land, you're isolated, there's strange and menacing cries in the night. I mean, I'd be a little on edge. The small group, however, responded with musket fire, and the cries ended for the night. But at daybreak, the arrows flew, and the Nausets attacked. The Pilgrims had already loaded most of the muskets on the boat. They did have the advantage of firepower, if not surprise, but they didn't have most of their guns with them. Now, I will say, in this short skirmish, neither side actually suffered loss of life. But it's important to note that most of the initial English colonials were not military men. They were not seasoned in hunting or firearms. They actually hired military men to teach, lead, and protect them in the New World. And these were largely soldiers of fortune who had come of age in the Netherlands during the Dutch struggle for independence. We spent some time talking about that struggle a few months back, so I think we're all well aware that that could be a tough neighborhood to come of age in. And many of these men of renown, like John Mason and John Underhill and Lyon Gardner, all ended up in the New England colonies. And I know we've mentioned John Mason a couple of times before. We'll mention all three of these guys in later episodes as the story unfolds. We're still about a decade away from their grand entrances. But for now, we want to focus on one of their veteran comrades, Miles Standish. Captain Miles Standish had been in Plymouth, England. He was a born Englishman. He came from Duxbury in Lancashire. He was born in 1584. Standish was small in stature, but he was a trained soldier, and he was well-read in military theory, both contemporary theory of his day and the classics. And he had been a lieutenant in the English forces in the Netherlands. He'd also been in Leiden at the same time as the Pilgrims. Now, he wasn't a Pilgrim, but he did live with them. And it was from this time that he spent with the Pilgrims in Leiden that William Bradford, Edward Winslow, and Isaac Allerton solicited and installed Standish as their military commander. And it was his expertise that safely delivered this small party back to the others that December day. Remember, they were on reconnaissance, looking for a place to settle. I think of this whole thing like a really well-done movie scene, or as if I was actually there. I mean, when I was younger, I did camp out in the woods, and sometimes without a tent, under the stars. In a familiar place, though, my neighborhood, the woods near my house. But even in that environment, as familiar as it was, as relatively tame as the landscape was, it could get eerie as the night progressed. As the darkness and the dampness set in, as the familiar shadows and sounds of the woods seemed almost to change into something unfamiliar. And it was easy to get a little spooked. I mean, that was part of the fun. But these guys were not camping in a familiar place. And they weren't familiar with the general area. And they couldn't simply go home in the morning. There was an untamed aspect, a legitimate danger in their environment. So the barricades had been made and sentinels had been placed. Now, the guns they had, at least some, were matchlocks, as opposed to the better crafted flintlocks of the day. Matchlocks were cheaper. And they were cheaper for a reason. First of all, they were antiquated. They were heavy, difficult weapons to manage. And the user, if possible, would use a forked rest to stabilize their shot. They weren't very efficient as weapons. I mean, they were better than bows and arrows, potentially more dangerous, certainly scarier when you fired them, but they weren't very accurate and they were slow to reload. I mean, the trick would be to have numbers and fire in rotation. That's what they had done in Europe. You didn't fire all at once because then it takes a long time to reload, then nobody can fire and everybody's loading and everybody's vulnerable. Now, the lock that admitted the fire was a pan with powder in it. And there was a slow-burning match called a serpentine that was held on a cock. And to operate, you had to open the pan and pull the trigger. And the serpentine would be pressed to the pan, so you'd put fire to powder. And sparks from the ignited powder entered the barrel through a small opening. Now, this action ignited the powder charge that propelled the shot. And to repeat this, like in battle, was a very slow process. So men like Miles Standish would highly recommend the flintlock, which was much quicker and easier to use. In time, it would be the legislated weapon of choice. Because in just a few decades, the colonials would be compelled, through ordinance, to develop their own military skills, militias, and they would be expected to provide their own firearms, under penalty of fine. So the matchlock was cheap, and even though it was clumsy and inefficient, it would remain in use throughout most of the 17th century. So anyways, those are the weapons they had that day. Back to our story on the shores of Cape Cod, December 1620. A small group sent out from the fledgling Pilgrim settlers were camped for the night. They were only a small party armed with matchlocks in a hostile environment. I mean, at night, they had to wrap the guns to protect them from the morning dew. Water or dampness could render them absolutely useless. I mean, the slow-burning match, the pan of powder, you get it. The point is, think about their situation. This environment, these weapons, they're few in number, and an unknown populous foe very comfortable in the immediate environment. I mean, after all, this was their home. And in the eyes of those natives, the Pilgrims were not guests. They were intruders, and they were a potential threat. I mean, this is a great movie scene, isn't it? I'd much rather watch this on a movie screen than to actually have to experience something like this myself. And so it was. At the sound of the aforementioned cries, the men discharged 2 shots, creating a certain heightened vulnerability. I mean, remember, it's going to take a while to reload those guns. The next morning, the same cry was heard. And the natives were not just seen, they attacked. The Pilgrims were caught off guard. I mean, to me, that seems weird. I doubt that I'd be caught off guard in a situation like that. I'd have been on pins and needles. Before the cries in the darkness the night before, but after the cries in the darkness of the night before, I'd have been ever vigilant. But when the attack came, they had been packing up, and only 4 men had their guns close by. The others were already on the boat. And this is where the experience of Miles Standish paid dividends for his employers. This is why you hired a guy like Miles Standish. This is the first of many times that his professional training and experience delivered those that he was sworn to protect. Standish, who had a flintlock, immediately fired, as well as another man. And that bought them some time. I mean, I imagine it gave the natives pause. I mean, they knew what a musket was. If you ask me, both sides are showing more than just a little courage here. I mean, first of all, you're in the situation, you've got no choice, but the Nausets are actually running toward this barricade, probably understanding there's muskets in there. And the Pilgrims are vastly outnumbered. And frankly, even though their guns might be more dangerous at close range, there's not a lot of Pilgrims and the guns aren't very efficient. And you get my point. This could be an ugly scene. It would be understandable, tragic, but understandable if panic had set in. I mean, remember, these were not military men by trade or training. They weren't seasoned in the wilderness. It would be understandable if panic had taken hold, if the whole party had been killed. But Standish performed as was expected. I think the men must have really trusted him because as he began to take control, they listened. I mean, that's a hard thing, getting someone to listen when all hell breaks loose. Getting a group of people to listen when all hell breaks loose is even harder. Those early guns were not only difficult, they were not accurate, as I've said. The European theaters depended on numbers of shots fired and not marksmanship. I mean, defense was of the essence. So Standish had 2 men stand at the entrance of the barricade and ordered them to hold their fire until they could take, quote unquote, full aim at the attackers, until they knew they'd hit them. That takes listening under pressure. You're listening to instructions as the danger is approaching. And it takes courage to listen under pressure because your first thought is fight or flight, right? You either want to run or you want to run away from the problem or you want to engage it immediately. So he had those with guns stay behind with him while the others were dispatched to the boat to get theirs. So you got a few guys with slow to reload muskets trying to hold off attackers while other guys, more than 4 presumably, run pretty much unarmed, at least putting themselves out in the open and facing away from the oncoming danger, right? I mean, they're running to the boat. That's exhilarating. That must have been a matter of seconds there, just mere moments. But again, to me, Miles Standish proved his mettle right here and there. The goal was also to defend the rear guard, their route of escape. I mean, if everything else fails, you just run to the boat. The muskets were recovered, though, and the small group managed to fire off a few more volleys. And with that, the natives fled. And then this brave little group actually split up. Some stayed behind to guard the camp, while others gave chase. Now, after about a quarter mile of yelling and firing a few more shots, they returned to camp themselves. But I think that's pretty ballsy. I mean, they had no idea what they were chasing after. What if there was 1,000 Indians out there? But they had given chase as a show of force. They wanted to demonstrate, it was very important to demonstrate to the natives that they were not afraid, even if they were. When it was over, at least 18 arrows were found on the walls, and even a few of them were found in hanging coats on the walls of the barricades. Some of those arrows were copper-tipped. And it was this event that was christened by Miles Standish as the Battle of First Encounter. This whole episode underscores a scenario that would play out many times, dozens, perhaps hundreds in the colonial future. And it's important that we tackle this now. We'll tackle it again later, probably as various battles come up. But I want to talk about this a little bit. This is a small example of the difference, I feel, the superiority at this time of European warfare. I mean, if you're fighting like one-on-one or a couple guys on a couple of guys, I think that goes to the natives. But if you're talking collectively, as far as battles go, an organized formation, that goes to the colonials, it goes to the Europeans. The idea is usually conveyed that the Europeans had to adapt to the native ways to survive. And that's partly true. But the basic philosophy of warfare wasn't changed by the Europeans. The tactics may have evolved, but the philosophy didn't. I mean, the key difference, according to some military tacticians, was that the natives fought offensive wars. The Europeans fought defensively. That doesn't mean that they didn't go on the attack or on the offensive sometimes. It means that they fought with tactics and strategies that were designed to keep the troops in specific formations, guarding their flanks and preserving the rear guard on purpose. We can see here that Standish adapted this European style to these surroundings. I mean, I always picture the European battlefield, those huge monolithic battlefields with thousands of guys on either side. I know there weren't a lot of battles maybe that had thousands like that. Sometimes the movies can exaggerate, but you get the point. This huge, massive clearing with hundreds of men and these huge battalions and formations on either side. It looks like a chessboard. But the strategies that went into those types of battles can be seen in Standish's approach that day in December, so many years ago on the shores of Cape Cod. The day the Battle of First Encounters was fought. Standish had created a defensive position for his people. I mean, even before trouble presented itself, he had prepared. That's really a good strategy for life if you think about it. Think ahead, expect the unexpected. He had established a safe place with barriers. They had been shielded from the arrows and they avoided injury or death because of that. That's a defensive tactic. He had placed sentinels for early warning. That's defensive. When the fight did come, he kept his men together and organized in a defensive position. They didn't lose their minds. They didn't separate. They functioned as one unit for safety and also to repulse the enemy. And when he did have to separate them, he protected his rear guard from attack. He kept men facing out to protect his flank. He wasn't going to let the attacking Indians get around and surround them. Even the pursuit was choreographed when you think about it. Men were intentionally left behind to guard the camp, while others gave quick, short pursuit. In the heat of the battle, he had controlled their emotional urges by instructing them and reminding them to hold steady and to not shoot right away. Even with this small band, they fired in rotation, making sure that there was always men who could fire if need be while others were reloading. They proceeded without any escalation from here. And a week later, the Pilgrims entered Plymouth Harbor. The location was appealing geographically and topographically. I mean, the harbor was sheltered. There were rivers nearby and a gentle hillside and fields that were now vacant that had been recently cleared. The soil was easy to work. And the area had been cleared of trees, which made it really easy to see farther out in case hostiles were approaching. I mean, this was a good location. The previous inhabitants probably thought so too. It had been the home of the Patuxet tribe, a part of the larger Wampanoag tribe, Squanto's hometown, cleared and abandoned by a plague that had wiped them all out, except the kidnapped Squanto, who was in Europe at the time. I mean, maybe that's the one positive result of Thomas Hunt's treachery, was that Squanto was spared, survived, and came back. So anyways, the Pilgrims, as far as they were concerned, they were home, but they were vulnerable. And don't forget, half of these folks would be dead in just a couple of months. So you got a new land, hostile neighbors, poor nutrition, death. How would you be feeling right now if you were one of these original Pilgrims? The little settlement was under surveillance and intimidation from the start. They were subjected to the same wild cries as from the Cape Cod shoreline. They witnessed great smokes of fire in the distance, but when they investigated, the natives would have already left. And there were other sightings from a distance, but no direct interaction. I mean, that could cause anxiety. I think after a few days, a few weeks, a few months of that would grate on my nerves. And again, there's nowhere else for these people to go. You can't just call it quits, right? I mean, again, everybody's hungry, everybody's sick, people are dying, and you have the constant reminder that you're being watched. And it's by the grace of God alone that you're not simply slaughtered. I mean, who would even know if something happened to you? Who was there to help you? I wonder if they thought about Roanoke in those days. I mean, I know there's other failed colonies. We've talked about some of them, but Roanoke had that weird mystery about it right from the beginning. Anyway, later in the winter, February, tools were stolen from the fields. And there was an instance where two natives presented themselves at a faraway distance. But when Miles Standish and another guy approached them, they ran away. And as Standish approached the area that they were in, he became aware of the fact that these men were only two of a larger group that was gathered just on the other side of the hill. That would have given me pause. I think about Custer at the Little Bighorn, right? He thinks he's going after like a smaller group of Lakota, and all of a sudden, holy crap, you're outnumbered 30 to 1, 50 to 1, whatever it was. I mean, that kind of could have been the situation here. Standish was pretty brave to have left the group, and he goes out and again, he's probably quite a ways away from the barricades at this point, and he notices that it's not just two, it's many. So in mid-March, the Pilgrims were planning their defenses when a certain native, naked, boldly approached them, and he greeted them in English with "welcome," to their utter surprise and amazement. This was a real watershed moment. I mean, I think about the reality that they could have understandably overreacted and killed him before he was allowed to get too close or even to utter his greeting of welcome. Think about what they'd been through. You wonder, the psychological trauma. Do they have PTSD at this point? The Pilgrims, though, historically, we'll see this, their mindset before they came to the New World, and certainly now that they're here and into the future, they were actually very cordial and fair with the natives, by comparison to other Europeans, even other English and Puritans. That would play itself out over time. I mean, we're going to work through a few situations where we can kind of flesh that out and verify, but they're showing level-headedness right here. Now, this man's name was Samoset. And he wasn't a local guy. He was actually from the Maine area up north. He'd been in the area since the previous summer, and he told them that he had learned English. It was broken but functional from fishermen that he had had contact with back home. He'd been in the area since the previous summer when he had come down with Thomas Dermer. And remember, that's the same guy that brought Squanto back from England to the Wampanoags. It's the same guy, Thomas Dermer, ultimately that was going to be killed by the Nausets. so his influential and visionary ideas would be cut short. But Samoset had spent the winter with the Wampanoags and was very informative about the local population. He told the Pilgrims of tribal names and locations, as well as strength and numbers. Samoset told the Pilgrims of the extent of the toll that the European diseases had taken on the native populations. And he explained that the natives were hostile towards the English, but also they feared the white man's God. Now, in return, the Pilgrims provided Samoset with a virtual feast. And before he left, they presented him with 3 gifts: a knife, a bracelet, and a ring. And when he was leaving, Samoset promised to return with others, and he said that he would help facilitate trade between the Pilgrims and the natives. And now things really start to move in the Pilgrims' favor. Not advantage, like, mind you, over the natives, like somehow they were going to become, more dominant in the region. But a genuine, favorable situation was about to unfold. A favorable situation that would remain largely in place for decades. It took only a few days for the first positive gesture by the local natives to present itself. The stolen tools from the previous month were returned. And the natives who first visited Plymouth did in fact start to trade with them. And they weren't just cordial with the Pilgrims, they were genuinely friendly. Now the next step, a few days later, March 22nd, 1621, a day that should be recognized, a day that should live in infamy. Is that a word, infamy? It's not infamy because this was a good thing. A day that should live in infamy is a bad thing. So this is a day that should live in infamy, right? Anyway, this was the big one, the motherlode of motherlodes, the best possible scenario the Pilgrims could ever have hoped for. Although it started out as an oh crap moment. Here's what happened. Massasoit himself, the main chief, the main sachem of the Wampanoags, visited Plymouth with 60 warriors. Here's the problem. They came unexpectedly. The Pilgrims were very alarmed and very confused as to what to do. I mean, what would you have done? Irrespective that of the recent past, they brought the tools back and you had some trade, some good time. You met Samoset, everything's going wonderful, But let's face it, the winter had been long and hard. These guys didn't even have 60 people left total. And they were sick. And yet here comes Massasoit with 60 warriors. Strong men, healthy men, well-fed men, armed men. I mean, guns or no guns, I think they'd have been in real trouble had Massasoit had any intention whatsoever of violence that day. Now, if you can't tell, I really like Massasoit as a historical figure. I like him in this narrative. I like in the actual, historical narrative, not just the, hey, this is my choice of what I'm going to tell you narrative. I think he'd have been a cool guy to meet. He was fair and rational. Make no mistake about it. He was not a pushover or a fool. He was a leader with a leader's vision. He lived in a violent, hostile world. He had real enemies to worry about. You'll see. Not everybody in a leadership role is actually a leader. You realize that, right? Like, that's a scenario that seems to expose and play itself out all too often in our contemporary society today, whether it's personal, professional, political. I mean, name the field of play. But Massasoit was a leader. So the residents of Plymouth were intimidated, I would be, but did not want to offend their visitors. They didn't know what to do. They wanted to get along. And it's amazing what can happen when people enter into even uncomfortable situations with strangers, people that are not like themselves, with the goal of peace. The Pilgrims were uncomfortable, but they wanted peace. Massasoit obviously wanted peace. He hadn't destroyed them. So you have a situation here. What to do? What would you do? And it's at this very moment that another native arrives on the scene. Now, he had come with Massasoit and began to intercede for the two sides, and his name was Tisquantum. History, our American history, our English-American history today remembers him as Squanto. And if you recall from a previous episode, Squanto was actually a really well-traveled, well-versed man of the world, frankly, well-versed about all of the world that he lived in. I mean, from a multicultural sense, from a native sense, certainly. But he'd been to Spain. He'd been in England. This guy was no slouch. He'd been up north in Maine. He'd been back to England. He came back to Cape Cod. His actions were no accident. He was no simpleton. He was an experienced, ambitious guy. And as we'll see, but for now, Squanto has returned home, and I wonder what his emotions were like. It had been about a decade, but this was his hometown. Everybody, everything he had ever known was gone. I mean, maybe the trees were there and the same hillside and the same rivers, but even the structures that the Pilgrims had built, they hadn't been there. What had happened to the structures that were there when he lived there? I don't know. I wonder about that. What an interesting conversation that would have been to have been able to pick his brain and ask him, what are your thoughts about this? Maybe I'm a sap. It seems like it must have been quite an emotional experience. So the Pilgrims were very fortunate. Providence appeared to smile on them from the start. They made the trip across the Atlantic way later in the year than they should have. They survived the Battle of First Encounter. They managed to find a harbor that had been recently abandoned but was ready for settlement. They had the good fortune to have settled at a time when Samoset was in the area. I mean, maybe he wasn't so hostile to the English in general, as the local natives were. Maybe he convinced Massasoit that they could be useful to him. Maybe not. But his welcome sure did turn out to be sincere, didn't it? From him, they inherited Squanto as a permanent resident. And it was from Samoset that they inherited a friendship, a true friendship with a strong local leader. That's not too bad, all in all. It's not too bad at all. Now, his European chroniclers describe Massasoit this way, quote, a very lusty man in his best years, an able body, grave of countenance, spare of speech. In his attire, little or nothing differing from the rest of his followers. Only a great chain of white bone beads about his neck. And at the behind his neck hangs a little bag of tobacco, which he drank and gave us drink. His face was painted with a sad or deep red like Murray or mulberry, and oiled both head and face, that he looked greasily. And one more thing, a great long knife hung on a string at his breast. It's quite a picture. We'll discover what happened next time. I promise you it'll be exciting, but for this time, I truly hope the history has come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.